So you want to create a static but interactive website. Perhaps you want to show off your portfolio, or you want to create a landing page to test demand for a potential product that you're working on. Well, either way, there are a million and one ways to go about this, but one of the fastest and most developer-friendly ways I have encountered recently is by using the build tool Vite. Now, if you've worked with Solid.js in the past, then you're probably familiar with Vite because Solid.js uses this out of the box as its build tool. Essentially, what Vite does is it takes care of things like hot modular replacement, of local network hosting, of minified bundling, of path resolution, and much, much more. The goal for today is to start a new website from scratch using TypeScript and Vite as our build tool. We will also create a continuous deployment pipeline using GitHub Actions so that every code change that we commit to our main branch gets automatically published on GitHub pages. So as always, grab a drink and let's start coding. To make our life easier when creating a Vite project, we're going to use a Vite template. You can find those templates under the Vite website, Getting Started, and then Scaffolding Your First Vite project. You will find just the default create Vite command, but further down here you can also find several templates. And in our case, we will be using the vanilla TypeScript template. You have the note here that if you have NPM version 6 or lower, you will need to use a different command. If you have version 7 plus, then you are going to use this command. To figure out which version you currently have, just run npm-v. And in my case, that's 9.1, so I will be using the second version. If you have a version that's 6 or below, you might actually want to upgrade NPM first before continuing. So let us just copy paste this command up till here, provide our own custom name. So in that case, it will be a Vite website, double hyphen, and then double hyphen again with the template flag. And in this case, that is vanilla-ts. Now that is completed, cd into the newly created directory and run npm install to install all of your dependencies. Now that is completed, you can open up your code editor and you can see that quite a few files were created for you. So you have your index.html file and you have quite a few files under your source directory and you have a static asset under public as well. Before we go into those, let's just quickly take a look at the package.json file where you can see the dev command. This is what you'll be running during your local development, which will spin up a local development server, which also does hot modular reloading, etc. So any code changes will automatically be available in your browser. I like to add the host flag here. And what that will do is it will expose your website to your local network so that you can also visit your website from, for example, your mobile devices and other computers, which I personally enjoy for debugging purposes especially. So now go back to your terminal and we can just run npm run dev to see it all working. Here you already get a list of IP addresses that you can use on your network to visit your website. Or since we're running this on this machine, we can just use the local host directly. So let's open up a new tab. And we can see that the website is fully functional and running. What you can see here is functionality that is provided by the template that we just chose. As I just mentioned, Vite also does hot modular reloading. So what you can do is you can update your HTML. So let's just go into our index.html and, for example, change the title to my Vite website, hit save, and we immediately see this reflected on the top here. You can also see that Vite does not provide a vite.config file out of the box. That is because Vite is so convinced in its default settings for your usual use cases that they don't even overwhelm you with a config file, which is very, very new if you are used to things like Webpack with just very, very complex configs overall. You can also see a very cool feature that we are able to include a TypeScript file directly. This is not something that you would usually be able to do from within your HTML file because a browser does not know how to handle TypeScript files. You always need to compile TypeScript first into JavaScript, then you're able to import those. Vite takes care of all of that. It compiles your TypeScript by your tsconfig file that it automatically generated for you and will make those available to the browser. Now in the dev environment, there's a lot going on that might seem a bit magical. But what we can do is we can run the build command to see how it actually generates HTML and JavaScript files. So open up your terminal let's just close out of the currently running process and run npm run build. We can see that as a result of the build command, a dist directory was created, and into this dist directory we have an index.html file created. Now this index.html file isn't actually a direct copy of the previous index.html file. So if we go to our code editor and we open up the dist directory and open up the index.html, we can see that instead of the previously imported TypeScript file, we now have an imported JavaScript file. This JavaScript file carries the name index, and it also carries a unique identifier, which was automatically generated. We also have the same thing going on with our style sheet, even though if you look at the previous HTML file, we don't have any style sheet included directly in here. Instead, what we had is we had the style sheet imported in our main.ts file. So this is a fundamental principle of how Vite works in this setting. What Vite does is it looks at your index.html file for your entry point, and then it will check what sort of files you have imported from within your index.html file. It could be that you have your TypeScript files imported, or you could also have some other style sheets imported directly. What it will then do is it will look at those files and look at their respective imports again and build up this dependency graph. At the end, once it has all of its dependencies figured out, what it will do is it will create your dist directory, put your index.html file in its root, and then for all its dependencies, it will move those into your assets directory and append everyone with a unique identifier, because now everything is flattened out, right? So if you had the same file name in two different directories, then those would be conflicting here. And that's why now there is a unique identifier associated to them. You also see that all of your TypeScript is bundled into a single JavaScript file, and all of your CSS code is automatically minified. So all of that is pretty cool. Now you might notice one particular thing, and that is that we have within our dist directory, we have this vite.svg file. How did that get there? Well, the difference between our TypeScript SVG file and our Vite SVG file is their original location in our source. So the vite.svg file was included in our public directory. Now, anything you have in your public directory will be copied over one-to-one into the root directory of your build. So that is why Vite did not receive a unique identifier associated with it, which is very different to the assets like the TypeScript.svg file, which received a unique identifier. The reason for that is you might have some sort of dynamically generated imports, right? And that's exactly what happens here. If we look at our main.ts file, the way Vite is used, it is referenced directly just as text. That means if it was to receive a unique identifier in the build process, then this would no longer be found once the project is actually built. So that is why vite.svg is within the public directory, so we know the name won't change when we build it. If you use an import, however, like with the TypeScript logo, and we reference that directly, then Vite is able to resolve that URL directly. So this is something that's potentially very confusing at first, because there are two different ways of doing it, right? If you have something within public, you can't import it directly into your TypeScript or JavaScript files. Instead, you would have to hard code those names imports as strings. And if you have your assets within your source directory, for example, then you can import them and let Vite take care of the URL resolution. What I personally like to do is I like to structure my source directory a little more. At the moment, you can see that you have TypeScript files, CSS files, and image files all mixed together. So what I like to do is I like to create an assets directory and move the images into that. Then I like to create a scripts directory and move all of my TypeScript files into that. And what I like to do is I like to rename my main.ts to index.ts, just to make it more obvious to myself that this is the main entry point for our index.html file. Of course, after having done that, we need to update our imports. So our TypeScript.svg file is no longer located in the same directory, but instead it's located under assets and then TypeScript. And the same is true for our index.html file. The main.ts is no longer called main.ts, but it's called index.ts, and it's located under the scripts directory. And all of those changes are just for you as a developer and structuring your own development code. Later on, no matter what your directory structure is, everything will just be automatically flattened out into your assets directory in your build. So let's just make sure that all of these changes worked by running npm run dev again. We get an import error that is the style sheet, which we import our index.ts. So let's just go one directory up. And we also need to move the assets one directory up as well. That has worked. So let's go back to our browser. And the website is still functional. So now that our basic setup is complete, we can create a GitHub repository for our website. So go to GitHub, click on New. Now for your repository name, you have two options. We want to host this as GitHub Pages later on. And with GitHub Pages, you can either host GitHub Pages as a user page, for which the URL will be your GitHub username, so in my case, resoluteerror.github.io, or it can be a repository page, in which case the URL will be your GitHub username, so resoluteerror.github.io/your repository name. Depending on what you need to choose your repository name here as well. So if you want to have a GitHub user page, your repository name should match your GitHub name, so resoluteerror.github.io. If you just want to have a GitHub page for that repository, we can just use any repository name of our choosing. So in my case, I will just call it Vite website. No description at all, make it public and create the repository. Now let's copy this part down here from the git commit onwards. Go to our website, call git init, git add everything, and then just copy paste the commit and the pushing. Now, because we chose a custom repository name, we need to adjust our Vite config, and for that we need to create Vite config in the first place. The reason being, if we look at our imports in our dist directory and index.html, you will see that all of our paths reference the root and move on from there. Now, the problem with that is that the repository name will be appended in the path before our actual assets, etc. So none of these paths will properly resolve. To fix that, create a new file called vite.config.ts. And what we can do is we can import the define config from Vite, which will allow us to have a type safe config, and then just export that as well and define a base. In our case, the base will be /Vite website/. Save that. And that's already all we need to do. If we rerun the npm run build command, you will see that in our dist directory, the index.html file is updated and now contains the Vite website path in all of our URLs. Additionally, you might remember that one URL was hard-coded, and that was in the index.ts file, where we had the vite.svg logo. Now, this, of course, wouldn't resolve anymore. But what we can do is we can use the base URL provided by Vite as a type of environment variable. And this base URL we can use in here to prepend our vite.svg. If we wouldn't provide a custom base URL, then this would simply be a /. Now that we did provide a custom base URL, this will be equal to whatever we provided here, so /Vite website/. Also make sure to remove the appending / over here. So it's just base URL vite.svg. And this will make sure that this path also resolves properly once we eventually build and deploy this project. Now I would like to spend a second to reiterate the difference between assets and public imports, because that's one of the things I personally found the most confusing when getting started with Vite. If you're already familiar with that, feel free to use the timestamps to skip forward to the final section where we deploy our website using GitHub Actions to our GitHub pages. But before you do that, make sure you leave a like if this video has been helpful so far. I would greatly appreciate it. So for this example, I would like to do two things. I would like to include an image in our index.html, and I would also like to include an Open Graph image in our header. Open Graph images, if you're not familiar, is an additional information that will be used by things like Facebook when you're sharing your website URL to display preview image. And that is something we set in our head section. However, Vite doesn't parse those properly yet, so that's why we need to use the public import to have a predictable URL. So first off, let's start with importing the image into our index.html file. For that purpose, I've already defined a little cat image, which I will pull into my assets directory within source, because that will be resolved by Vite itself. So afterwards, let's go to index.html file, and after the div with the ID app, let's just add a new div container and add an image with the source. And here we specify the source directly from our index.html. So from our index.html, we would have to go into source, we would have to go into assets, and in there we would have the funny cat pic .webp. We can also add a bit of styling to it and save it. Now we can go back to our terminal and run, first of all, let's clear the terminal and hit npm run dev again. And you will see the cat appearing here on the right. Now, if we just stop our dev server and run npm run build, we will see that Vite picks up our funny cat image and moves it into the dist assets directory. Now, it is important to note that Vite moved this into assets, not because our original image is within source assets, but because Vite identifies this as a type of asset that it wants to include. In fact, we can quickly demonstrate this by moving within assets, having like a cats directory, moving funny cat into that, and renaming our import to cats funny cat. Run npm build again, and you see the directory here hasn't changed. What we can also do after having run npm run build is we can run npm run preview. And what that will do is it will rely on your build files, so you can always check if those dependencies resolve properly. So that's our website. And now we want to create an open graph image. For that, let's just quickly take a little screenshot of our website. Usually you would want to make sure that it matches certain dimensions, and copy paste that screenshot into your public directory. Let's rename the file to be called ogimage.png. So now all we need to do is go to our index.html file, go into our head, and let's create a new meta tag with the name ogimage and the content of the URL. Now for the ogimage tag, you need the complete URL starting from the HTTPS. Now this is where the public directory comes into play, because anything that's within public will just be copied over to the root directory under its original name. So this would still be Vite website / and then og-image.png. Save that. And of course, have the closing tag there as well. What we can now do is we can stop this, run npm run build. It doesn't appear here because it's not really part of the dependency graph. But if you look into your dist directory, you will see that there is now this ogimage.png included as well. And you can also see that in your index.html file, nothing was changed on the URL of your meta import. So in general, as a rule of thumb, if you have any sort of imports either in your index.html or you're importing images in your TypeScript files or any sorts of assets directly via imports, then you always want to include those as assets in their assets directory or somewhere under source. If for some reason you aren't able to specify the import directly in your TypeScript files and you just specify them via strings, and you need a deterministic location where those images or assets will be hosted later on, in that case, use the public directory because those will just be copied over directly. Make sure to leave a comment below if you feel that the distinction is entirely clear and you have some more questions that you would like to have answered. Now, all that's left for us to do is create the GitHub workflow to create our GitHub action and to push all of that to our GitHub pages. First of all, what we need to do is we need to enable pages for this repository. So go back to your browser, open up GitHub, refresh your repository, and in your repository you can go to settings and scroll down to pages. And there you will see the build and deploy source deploy from branch. Now that's not what we want to do. We just want to push our source code and we want to make sure that our GitHub actions take care of building and deploying our website. So change that from deploy from branch to GitHub actions. It will automatically save that and you will get an information up here, GitHub pages source saved. that's already all you need to do in the GitHub UI. What you can do now is go back to your project and close all these directories. You want to create a new folder called .github. The period in the beginning is important. And then within your GitHub folder, create a new folder called workflows. And into this workflows, you will want to create a new file, which we will call deploy.yml. The YML stands for YAML, which is very similar to JSON, just with a little bit of a different syntax. Now, lucky for us, Vite already provides the entire code we need for this file. We don't need to do any changes. So what you can do is you can go to Vite, deploying a static site, and then down to GitHub pages. Here you already also get the information with what you need to do with the base configuration in your Vite config if you decide to publish this as a repository page, which is what we're doing. And then down here you have the entire workflow. So all you have to do is you have to copy it, go back to your code editor, and paste that into the deploy YAML. Now, what happens here is essentially whenever you push something to your main branch, which I called my branch in this case, then this workflow will be triggered. And what this workflow does is it will spin up a virtual Ubuntu machine and perform all of these steps. So first off, it will perform a checkout on the newest code changes. It will set up Node, so it has npm available. It will run npm install and npm run build. So any modifications you do to your build in your package.json file will also be carried over here. And then it will perform this upload artifacts step, which essentially will just take everything that is in your dist directory and push that to pages. And the implementation of each of these steps are essentially also just GitHub repositories, which are publicly available and you can also check out. So this is essentially just a parameter that is being passed into this code base. And then there's this deploy step, which just takes the artifact and deploys it to GitHub pages. Make sure you save that and make sure you commit everything. So git add everything, git commit, git push. And you can now open up your GitHub repository again. And you will see that you have this little icon here, which is yellow if it's currently in progress, red if it failed, and green if the last GitHub action succeeded. You can also go to actions to see the current process and click on it. And you can see that it's currently in the deploy step. It built the artifact, it's deployed to GitHub pages. And finally, the job completed. If you click on the last item, you also see the URL here to which it was deployed. So you can just click on that. And you can see your website is now available with all of the paths and the images configured. You can also make sure that the Open Graph image that we configured is available. So we can just click on View Page Source. And up here, we see the OG image. We can just copy that URL and paste it in here and see if that resolves. Well, we don't see a change because it was just an image of our website, but we can see here that this is actually an image, not our actual website. So that works as well. And that's already all there is to it. Now, every time you commit code changes to your main branch, your GitHub workflow will automatically pick those up and deploy those to your GitHub pages website. You also have the ability to add your own custom domain for your GitHub pages. There's quite a bit of documentation on GitHub itself. I will just link that in the description below. If you have reached this point, congrats on having completed your entire website setup. If this video has been helpful to you at all, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to this channel for future videos. There are a lot more things to explore with Vite, for example, including things like Tailwind, CSS, and other third-party plugins. Make sure to leave a comment below if you would like to see any of that in future videos. Thank you for sticking around until the end, and as always, happy coding.